Number 1. Deon Vann was 43 years old when police arrested him in Hammond, Indiana. He was a former United States Marine who left the service with an other-than-honorable discharge, and he was also a registered sex offender. By the time investigators were closing in, he had already spent years moving through the criminal justice system, including a Texas conviction for sexual assault. To many people around him, Vann didn't look like a threat. His ex-wife later told reporters she never knew him to be violent, which only deepened the shock when the case became public. After his release from prison in the summer of 2013, Vann moved back to Gary, Indiana, a city scarred by empty lots and abandoned homes. Those hollow buildings weren't just a symbol of decline. They became part of how he hid what he was doing. Prosecutors said he gravitated to an area where women gathered to survive through sex work or struggled with addiction, people already carrying heavy burdens and often treated as invisible. When detectives later asked why he started killing, investigators said he blamed anger and resentment tied to his earlier imprisonment. Over roughly the next year, Vann arranged meetings with women he did not know well, sometimes through online escort advertisements. Reports said at least one victim met him through the classified site Backpage.com. He brought these women to locations where he could control the situation. The method was consistent: he killed by strangulation. Afterward, instead of leaving victims where they might be quickly found, he used abandoned buildings in Gary to conceal them, turning forgotten structures into crime scenes that were easy to miss. The 7 women connected to his guilty pleas were Africa Hardy, 19 years old, Anith Jones, 35, Tayara Beatty, 28, Christine Williams, 36, Tracy Martin, 41, Sonia Billingsley, 53, and Tanya Gatlin, 27. For families, each disappearance meant a long stretch of unanswered calls and growing dread. In public statements, relatives pushed back against the idea that these victims were nobodies, insisting they were loved, remembered, and worth searching for. The investigation broke open in mid-October of 2014 after Hardy was found dead inside a motel room in Hammond. Police followed evidence from that night to identify Vann and locate him. Once in custody, he didn't limit his story to a single incident. He told detectives he had killed before, called the women mistakes, and said he would take police to additional victims. In the days that followed, officers searched multiple abandoned structures in Gary and recovered remains in the locations he identified, transforming one homicide investigation into a 7-victim serial murder case. The court process stretched on for years, and prosecutors at one point sought the death penalty. Then, in early May of 2018, Vann entered a guilty plea to 7 murder counts under an agreement that spared him capital punishment. On May 25th, he was sentenced to 7 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole, and he remains incarcerated in Indiana. Number 2. Desmond Turner was 28 years old when police identified him as a suspect in the Hamilton Avenue murders in Indianapolis, Indiana. He was an Indianapolis resident with a recent criminal record, and authorities described him as an ex-convict who was on parole at the time. In the neighborhood where he grew up, Turner wasn't a stranger. He had old friends, familiar streets, and people who recognized his face. That familiarity would later matter because the case against him leaned heavily on what neighbors said they saw and heard. In the weeks leading up to the killings, Turner started drifting back into that same area more often. Witnesses later described him asking unusual, specific questions about getting duct tape and about finding a high-powered rifle. The comments weren't framed as a plan to hurt anyone. They sounded like someone preparing for a robbery and trying to control what would happen inside a house. Prosecutors would argue that it was a pattern of escalation, a returning presence more urgent requests, and talk about targeting a nearby home because he believed there was money and drugs inside a safe. Investigators later said those rumors about a stash were not true, but the belief still shaped what happened next. On the night of June 1st, 2006, gunfire erupted at a home on North Hamilton Avenue. A call to 911 brought officers to the scene around 10 p.m. Inside, they found 7 family members killed, 4 adults and 3 children. The victims included Emma Valdez, her partner Alberto Covarrubias, and members of their extended family. Flora Albarran Magno Albarran and 3 children, Luis Albarran, David Covarrubias, and Alberto Covarrubias Jr. It was the kind of loss that collapses a family tree in a single night, leaving relatives to identify loved ones, and then face days of funerals and unanswered questions. Investigators believed the attack began as a home invasion robbery. The house had been searched through with signs that someone was looking for something specific and panicking when it wasn't found quickly. Witness accounts placed two men at the home, one carrying a long gun and another with a handgun. A friend who waited outside with Flora Albarn later told police she sensed something was wrong when the house was dark and unusually quiet, and then heard shouting and gunshots soon after people went inside. In the hours after the killings, Turner and another suspect, James Stewart, were believed to have fled in a borrowed pickup truck, setting off a manhunt that spread across the city. Turner didn't get caught in a chase. 2 days after the murders, he surrendered at a downtown fast food restaurant as police pressure tightened on people who might shelter him. Over time, prosecutors built their case largely through witness testimony and circumstantial details, even though they did not have the murder weapon and did not present forensic evidence placing Turner directly inside the home. Turner maintained his innocence, but in a bench trial, meaning a judge decided the case instead of a jury, he was found guilty on multiple counts tied to the killings and the robbery. In November of 2009, a judge sentenced Desmond Turner to life in prison without parole, plus an additional 88 years, and he remains incarcerated in Indiana. Number 3. Orville Lynn Majors was 36 years old when he was arrested on December 29, 1997, accused of killing patients at the hospital where he worked in Clinton, Indiana. Majors was a licensed practical nurse at the former Vermilion County Hospital. In a small community, that role carried automatic trust, and many families remembered him as calm and attentive during overnight shifts. Suspicion began years earlier in the early to mid-1990s, when the intensive care unit saw an unsettling increase in patient deaths. Staff members noticed how often emergency calls echoed through the halls. Administrators asked the Indiana State Police to investigate, and investigators compared staffing schedules to the timing of fatalities. The pattern they described was difficult to explain away. Deaths clustered when Majors was working, and the rate dropped when he was not scheduled. Witness testimony later suggested that, away from families, Majors sometimes spoke about patients with bitterness rather than compassion. Court records reference testimony that he made harsh remarks about elderly patients, including comments that they should be gassed. Prosecutors argued the case was less about a single outburst and more about control someone positioned in a place of authority, with access and privacy, choosing to misuse it. The charges focused on 7 sudden deaths. Investigators concluded Majors killed patients by injecting potassium chloride, and prosecutors also described the use of epinephrine. Both are legitimate medications in medical care, but medical experts testified that, given without a doctor's order and in excessive amounts, they can trigger a rapid crisis that may look like an abrupt collapse. Investigators said Majors was present at each of the 7 deaths, and that no one else was present at all 7. 6 patients became the names repeated in court coverage: Marianne Alderson, Dorothea Hickson, Luella Hopkins, Freddie Dale Wilson, Derek Maxwell, and Cecil Smith. Their relatives described the shock of learning that a hospital stay might have ended because of something intentional rather than illness. The defense argued the patients died naturally, and the case became a battle over records, timelines, and medical expectations. Building the case took years. Authorities reviewed charts, ordered exhumations in multiple cases, and searched for physical evidence linking medication access to a suspect. Police reported recovering vials and syringes, including containers tied to potassium chloride and epinephrine during searches connected to Majors. Separate from the homicide case, nursing regulators suspended his license after saying he practiced beyond the scope of a licensed practical nurse, including giving emergency drugs. Because publicity saturated the county, the trial was moved to Brazil, Indiana, and the jury was sequestered. After roughly 6 weeks of testimony, jurors deliberated for more than 3 days. In October of 1999, Majors was found guilty on 6 counts, and jurors could not reach a verdict on a 7th count, resulting in a mistrial on that charge. In November of 1999, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive 60-year terms, totaling 360 years in prison. Orville Lynn Majors died in custody at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City in September of 2017 while serving that sentence. Number 4. David Edward Maust, known around parts of northwest Indiana as Crazy Dave, was 49 years old when he was taken into custody in Hammond, Indiana in December of 2003. He was a former U.S. Army serviceman who had once been stationed overseas and later lived quietly as a renter in a rundown apartment house. To neighbors, he came off as odd and unpredictable, someone people talked about, but rarely challenged. What few people around him fully understood was how long his violence had been cycling through the justice system. Maust was born in Connellsville, Pennsylvania on April 5, 1954. As he grew up, records and later reporting described a childhood marked by instability and repeated time in institutions. That pattern followed him into adulthood. In Illinois, he was once found unfit to stand trial and committed to a state mental health facility before the courts later ruled him fit to proceed. The public picture that emerged was a man who could function on the surface, hold conversations, find places to live, blend in while carrying impulses that kept returning. Long before the Hammond case, Maust had already been convicted in connection with the death of a young teen in Germany during his military years, and later pleaded guilty in Illinois in the killing of a 15-year-old boy. Even after a long prison sentence, he was eventually released in the summer of 1999. When he arrived in Hammond, most people didn't know his past. Investigators would later describe a familiar pattern. He sought the company of teenage boys, offered alcohol and drugs, and used the promise of friendship to lower defenses. In 2003, 3 disappearances tightened the focus around him. Michael Dennis, 13 years old, and James Regagni, 16 years old, were last seen in early September. Nicholas James, 19 years old, had been reported missing months earlier. Detectives learned the younger teens had been spending time with Maust and that he had previously been arrested on a lesser charge after allegations he provided beer and marijuana to minors. That earlier contact with police did not stop what came next, but it placed his name in the file, an early warning that would matter when the missing persons cases would not resolve. A search of the building led investigators to the basement where they uncovered evidence hidden beneath a newly poured section of concrete. The remains of the 3 teens were recovered there, turning a missing persons investigation into a homicide case that stunned the region. In court, prosecutors said Maust admitted killing Regagni during a night of drinking. At his arraignment, witnesses reported that he scanned the courtroom and appeared to smirk as he was escorted away, a small detail that fueled public anger and deepened families' sense of disbelief. In November of 2005, Maust pleaded guilty to killing Dennis Regagni and James as part of an agreement in which the state would not seek the death penalty. The following month, a judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. David Edward Maust died in custody in Crown Point, Indiana on January 20, 2006. Number 5. Carl Eric Brandt, known to family and neighbors as Charlie, was 47 years old when police connected him to a double homicide in Maitland, Florida. For most of his adult life, he worked in technical jobs, including work described by investigators as radar technician work, and he lived a quiet routine in the Florida Keys with his wife, Teresa Terry Brandt. To friends, Charlie could seem reserved and even dependable, someone who liked order, kept to himself, and blended into the background. That public image hid a violent history that began in childhood. Brandt's family moved often when he was young, and he was described as shy but doing well in school. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, when he was 13 years old, he shot both of his parents inside their home. His mother, Ilsa Brandt, was pregnant and died. His father survived. Because of his age, the case moved through juvenile and mental health channels rather than adult court, and he was sent for psychiatric evaluation. According to reporting on the case, multiple evaluations did not produce a clear diagnosis that explained what happened, leaving investigators and the family with an unsettling question they could not answer. Why did a kid with no obvious history of violence suddenly do that? The family's response became part of the long fuse. After about a year in a psychiatric hospital, Brandt was released back to family custody and the household relocated to Florida. Over time, relatives avoided discussing the shooting, and some family members were raised believing the mother's death had been an accident. In adulthood, Brandt built a life that looked stable from the outside. He earned an electronics degree, married Terry, who owned a retail shop, and settled into a well-kept home on Big Pine Key. But behind the scenes, investigators later learned that Terry sometimes recorded concerns in personal notes, describing episodes of depression and weird talk moments that sounded less like a single crisis and more like a hidden pattern. In early September of 2004, Hurricane Ivan pushed the Brandts to evacuate the Keys. They accepted an offer from Terry's niece, Michelle Lynn Jones, to stay at her home near Orlando. Jones was 37 years old, a successful television executive, and close with her aunt. Friends later said the visit seemed normal at first dinner conversation, an attempt to ride out the disruption together. But as the days passed, Jones stopped returning calls, and her mother grew alarmed. A friend went to check on her. When no one answered and the house was locked, police were called. Investigators found Brandt dead by suicide in the garage. Inside the home, they discovered that Michelle Jones and Terry Brandt had been killed with a knife taken from the kitchen. There was no note, no explanation left behind, only a scene that raised immediate questions about planning secrecy and control. As detectives tried to understand what could have triggered the violence, Brandt's older sister came forward and told police about the childhood shooting in Indiana. That disclosure changed everything. Investigators searched Brandt's Keys home and reported finding anatomy materials and other items that suggested a long-running fixation. They also reopened older unsolved cases that fit his movements, including the 1989 killing of Sherry Parisho near Big Pine Key, which investigators later treated as solved by Brandt, even though he was no longer alive to prosecute. Carl Eric Brandt died by suicide in Maitland, Florida in mid-September of 2004. Number 6. David Ray Camm was 36 years old when he was arrested in southern Indiana, just days after his wife and children were found dead. A former Indiana State Police trooper, he was seen as athletic and dependable, someone who spent time with his kids and stayed connected to church and community routines. In public, he looked like a man with a clear path, a law enforcement career, a family, and a predictable life. On September 28, 2000, Kimberly Kim Camm, 35, and the couple's children Bradley, 7, and Jill, 5, were discovered in the garage of their Georgetown, Indiana home. All three had been shot. David Camm told investigators he had been playing basketball at Georgetown Community Church with a group of men who later backed up his alibi. He said he returned home and called 911 in shock. Within days, investigators focused on him, and the case shifted from mourning to accusation. Prosecutors built their theory around motive and forensics. In the first trial, they emphasized allegations of extramarital relationships, suggesting he wanted out of his marriage. By the third trial, they also highlighted life insurance, arguing that recent policies could have created financial motive. They leaned heavily on bloodstain interpretation, telling jurors that small spots on his shirt placed him at the moment the shots were fired. The defense argued the stains could have transferred during the frantic minutes after he arrived home and tried to reach his children. In early October of 2000, a judge approved a probable cause affidavit, and Camm was arrested. In the spring of 2002, a jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to a total of 195 years. In August of 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals reversed that conviction, ruling that the extensive focus on his personal behavior unfairly prejudiced the jury and was not properly connected to the murders. As the case moved forward, DNA evidence drew attention to another man, Charles Boney Jr. His genetic material was linked to a sweatshirt connected to the scene, and he was later convicted and sentenced to 225 years in prison. Even so, prosecutors continued to pursue Camm, shifting to a theory that Boney and Camm were connected. In a second trial, prosecutors introduced a new and highly inflammatory allegation as part of their theory of motive. In March of 2006, Camm was convicted again and sentenced to life without parole. In late June of 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court reversed that conviction, finding that speculative and prejudicial evidence should not have been allowed. By the third trial in Boone County, the story had narrowed to a contested timeline, whether he could have briefly left the church gym, committed the killings, and returned without anyone noticing. The defense highlighted consistent alibi testimony and additional forensic findings, including touch DNA, consistent with Boney on items connected to the victims. Public reaction remained sharply divided, and Camm later said he had not reconciled with Kim's family. On October 24, 2013, a jury found David Camm not guilty of all charges, and he was released from custody. Number 7. William Clyde Gibson III was 54 years old when police arrested him in southern Indiana. To people around New Albany, he could seem like an ordinary laborer, a man who did odd jobs, helped neighbors, and worked for a hardwood flooring company. A former employer said Gibson worked hard and was dependable until his habits shifted, and he began calling in, acting detached, and saying things that made coworkers uneasy. That public image hid a history with warning signs. Local reporting described Gibson as a convicted sex offender with long-running alcohol and drug problems. In an earlier case, a forensic psychologist described him as immature and emotionally unsophisticated, but still aware of what he was doing. Years later, during appeals, his defense pointed to a past head injury and mental health diagnoses, arguing that instability, addiction, and untreated symptoms shaped his behavior. In early 2012, that instability appeared to tighten into a crisis. Gibson's mother had recently died, and attorneys later argued he was in deep distress. Prosecutors focused on pattern, how he used familiarity, sympathy, or a promise of companionship to bring women close, then escalated when he felt rejected or out of control. The confirmed murders span a decade. In October of 2002, Karen Hodella, 44 years old, was killed after encountering Gibson during a night out in southern Indiana. The case stayed unsolved for years. Then on March 25, 2012, 35-year-old Stephanie Kirk met Gibson and ended up at his home. Court records later described a day of heavy drinking and drugs, ending with Kirk being killed by strangulation. Her disappearance sparked a search that ended only after Gibson's arrest. The following month, on April 18, 2012, Gibson contacted Christine Whitus, 75 years old, a family friend who had known him since childhood and was described as his late mother's best friend. She went to his home that day. Whitus was killed there also by strangulation. Investigators said Gibson did not call for help afterward, and the moment of discovery belonged to Whitus' family. The investigation turned after that discovery. Gibson's sisters went to the house, found Whitus, and contacted police. That same evening, officers arrested Gibson after a brief vehicle pursuit. In custody, he repeatedly asked to speak with investigators, waived his rights, and gave confessions. Those statements helped detectives locate evidence on his property and connect the case to Stephanie Kirk's disappearance. The arrest also reopened the Hodella homicide, linking crimes that had once seemed unrelated. In court, the outcomes came in stages. A jury convicted Gibson for Whitus' murder, and he received a death sentence on November 26, 2013. He later pleaded guilty in the Kirk case, and a judge sentenced him to death again on August 15, 2014. For Hodella's murder, he received a separate sentence of 65 years. Appeals and post-conviction challenges were denied in state court, and later filings show the case moving through the federal system. William Clyde Gibson III remains incarcerated in Indiana under sentence of death, with an additional term of years for the Hodella murder. Number 8. Angelica Salazar Alvarez was 27 years old when her 4 children died in Elkhart County, Indiana, and she was taken into custody the same week. Born on September 19, 1979, Alvarez had been working as a housekeeper at Norco Industries, and people around the neighborhood recognized her as a mother raising a busy household. Neighbors later described seeing the children outside riding bikes, playing on the sidewalk, waving at people who passed by. In a community with a strong Hispanic ministry presence, the kids were also remembered for attending a midweek Bible club, a small routine that made their absence feel even louder. In the weeks before the killings, investigators and family members described signs that Alvarez was not doing well. Reporting at the time said she was depressed after losing her job and had recently been hospitalized for nearly 2 weeks. Her employer said she quit in mid-September after about 3 years with the company. To people close to the family, it looked like a pressure building in silence, financial strain, exhaustion, and emotional instability that did not get better with time. On Tuesday night, November 14, 2006, Fernando Valdez, described in reports as Alvarez's husband and the father of her 2 younger children, returned home and found Alvarez and the children in the basement. He ran into the street shouting for someone to call police. Officers arrived to find 4 children dead at the scene and Alvarez unconscious with a faint pulse. Autopsies later determined the children died of asphyxia, and the prosecutor said the deaths were caused by strangulation. The victims were Jennifer Lopez, 8 years old, Gonzalo Lopez, 6 years old, Daniel Valdez, 4 years old, and Jessica Valdez, 2 years old. As shock spread through Elkhart, investigators moved carefully. Police said they made the arrest only after an extensive investigation, while details of physical evidence were kept sealed. Alvarez remained in the hospital under guard as a magistrate reviewed reports and found probable cause to hold her, while the prosecutor weighed charges. One day after funerals for the children drew hundreds of mourners, the Elkhart County prosecutor filed 4 counts of murder and publicly considered seeking the death penalty. The legal process stretched over months as the court addressed Alvarez's mental state and her ability to stand trial. The judge ultimately ruled her competent. On September 4, 2007, Alvarez pleaded guilty to 4 murder counts. As part of an agreement, prosecutors would not pursue the death penalty, and she would accept a life sentence without the possibility of parole for each child's death. At sentencing later that month, Alvarez told the judge she repented and accepted responsibility. In the courtroom, grief was not abstract. It had names and faces. The father of the 2 older children spoke and said he had found peace through faith and did not hate her, even as he described how devastating the loss had been. Outside court, the case left the community wrestling with a frightening question: how a family known for ordinary routines could collapse into tragedy inside a single home. Angelica Salazar Alvarez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for each of the 4 murders. Number 9. Judy D. Kirby was 31 years old when 7 people were killed on State Road 67 near Martinsville, Indiana, on March 25, 2000. Born on November 14, 1968, Kirby was a mother raising a large family on Indianapolis's South Side. To relatives, she had once seemed devoted and energetic, the kind of parent who managed school drop-offs, errands, and birthdays in the middle of everyday chaos. But in the months leading up to the crash, people close to her described a dramatic change, rising paranoia, sudden mood swings, and a sense that she was spiraling. Court records describe behavior that alarmed her family. Kirby wore disguises, placed cameras in trees, and told people she believed she was being watched and followed. She also spoke about ending her life. Prosecutors said her relationship with her boyfriend, Tinny Kirby, had become tumultuous, and that she feared losing both him and her children. They also argued she worried about being arrested because of drugs. Early in March of 2000, she was involuntarily admitted to the psychiatric unit at St. Francis Hospital. Doctors diagnosed psychosis, treated her with an antipsychotic medication, and noted hyperthyroidism, a thyroid condition the defense later emphasized. On the day of the crash, Kirby left her sister's home with 3 of her children and her nephew. The children were Jordan, 12 years old, Joni, 9 years old, and Jacob, 5 years old. Her nephew, Jeremy Young, was 10 years old. Her sister followed in another car, worried about Kirby's condition. Witnesses later described Kirby stopping in traffic and sitting motionless, staring straight ahead, while other drivers carefully went around. At one point, a neighbor offered her a cordless phone, and when Kirby drove off with it, the neighbor called 911. Later in Martinsville, Kirby bought gas and candy. Shortly after, she entered an exit ramp the wrong way and accelerated into oncoming traffic. Driver after driver swerved to avoid her horns blaring as she continued straight ahead. Court testimony noted that along the route she passed multiple wrong way and do not enter signs, and that an emergency lane was available. Investigators later said her brake lights were not on at the moment of impact. Kirby's car collided head-on with a van driven by Thomas Reel, 40 years old. Reel's children, Bradley and Jessica, were with him along with Bradley's friend Richard Miller. Reel and his children died at the scene, as did Kirby's 3 children and her nephew. Miller survived with serious injuries. Kirby was injured and treated, and the state filed murder charges on April 14, 2000. At trial, the central question was intent. Prosecutors argued Kirby was suicidal and deliberately drove into danger, accepting that her passengers and people on the road would die. The defense argued that illness and delusion combined with a confusing ramp design and inadequate treatment meant she could not form that intent. A jury convicted Kirby of 7 counts of murder and related felonies. On June 13, 2001, she was sentenced to an aggregate term of 215 years in prison, and she remains incarcerated serving that sentence. Number 10. Sarah Jo Pender was 21 years old when 2 of her roommates, Andrew Cataldi and Tricia Nordman, were killed in Indianapolis, Indiana. Born on May 29, 1979, Pender was working office jobs and trying to build a steady routine. People around her described a woman who could be confident and social. But the home she shared with Cataldi Nordman and her boyfriend Richard Hull had become tense and unpredictable. Neighbors and later court accounts described frequent arguments, especially between Hull and Cataldi. Prosecutors said disputes involved money and drugs, and that the house felt like a place where pressure kept rising. Pender has said she tried to stay out of the confrontations, but investigators argued she was not simply caught in the middle. They focused on choices that, in their view, showed planning rather than panic. On the morning of October 24, 2000, Hull drove Pender to a retail store where a 12-gauge shotgun and ammunition were purchased. A clerk later told investigators that Hull selected the items, but Pender paid. Prosecutors argued Hull could not legally buy a firearm, so the purchase went through her, and they treated that as a key piece of intent. Pender's defense argued she was being used and did not understand what Hull intended. That night, Hull later admitted he fired the shots that killed Cataldi, 24 years old, and Nordman, 25 years old. Instead of calling police investigators, said the bodies were moved and left in a dumpster a short distance away. Detectives later described signs of cleanup inside the house, including borrowed equipment used to scrub away traces. Prosecutors told jurors that those steps showed cooperation after the fact. Pender was arrested 4 days after the killings. At trial in Marion Superior Court in the summer of 2002, prosecutors argued she helped set the event in motion by buying the weapon and then helped conceal what happened. The case against her relied less on forensic proof and more on testimony. A jailhouse informant testified that Pender admitted responsibility, and prosecutors introduced a letter they said she wrote to Hull taking blame and urging him to destroy it. The defense challenged the informant's incentives and argued the letter was forged, saying Pender's actions reflected fear and reckless loyalty, not orchestration. The jury convicted Pender of 2 counts of murder, and the judge imposed a 110-year sentence. Hull, who admitted he was the shooter, accepted a plea deal and received a lengthy prison sentence. Pender continued to claim she was wrongly convicted, and the case became a point of public dispute with later reporting, raising concerns about the reliability of informant testimony and the contested letter. In August of 2008, Pender escaped from the Rockville Correctional Facility. Authorities said a correctional officer helped her leave with civilian clothes and used a prison vehicle to get her past the gate. She fled to Chicago under an alias until a neighbor recognized her after a television broadcast of America's Most Wanted and called police. She was recaptured in late December of that year and returned to Indiana custody. Sarah Jo Pender remains incarcerated in Indiana, serving her 110-year sentence.